Okay, we're ready to go. Hello, everybody. Welcome to this session today. My name is Carla Treloar. I'm from the Centre for Social Research in Health at UNSW. We're coming from the lands of the Bidjigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay respects to elders past and present, and acknowledge any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander colleagues in the room or joining online today. So this session is about the power of words, promoting inclusive and stigma-free communication in medical research. So we're all here to learn. We can ask all the questions we like. It's not a session to make people feel bad. It's a session to bring this issue to life and help us understand how we can promote inclusive and stigma-free practice in our own work as researchers. So as chair today, I'm going to introduce a range of fantastic speakers coming from different perspectives on this, but I wanted to take the chair's prerogative and share just 2 slides. So the first one you can see here is from a paper called Culture, the Missing Link in Health Research. And I really wanted to direct people's attention to the left-hand blue larger societal culture bubble. It's something that doesn't get looked at very often in how we form our knowledge, the questions we ask, and how we communicate about our research. We are all products of the culture that we grew up in, whether that be a white Anglo society or from various other parts of the world. We're also all grown up in, mostly, I would imagine, in a patriarchal society. Most of us only know a world with the war on drugs. Most of us only know various aspects of the ways in which our worlds have been shaped by laws, by policies, and by language. And some of those we need to unlearn over time. So to prepare for this yesterday, I was reading a blog about astrophysics, of which I know nothing. But they were talking about how various phenomena in outer space were named using language from our predominant culture. And one of those terms, there were a number of them which, don't really bear repeating, but one of them was the Merry Widow star. Now, it's a reference to spiders, but it's also a pernicious representation of women, drawing on issues of promiscuity and danger. So why on earth would you call a star a thing in those outer space using those types of words and conceptualizations? So we're not the only group in the world tussling with issues of language. And in fact, if I can get the next slide to appear, I'm just going to throw up one from the diabetes world in Australia. They've got a fantastic language matters resource online, and at the bottom, an excellent international consensus statement on stigma and diabetes in Lancet Diabetes and Endocrinology. So this is something that's happening all over the world in all sorts of different areas of health and medical research, and we should be thinking about these kinds of things too. So I'm going to hand over the lectern now to the Kirby Institute's very own Dr. Danielle Russell. Danielle's a postdoc at the Kirby Institute, having come from Arizona State University, where she did her PhD. So over to you, Danielle.
Yeah, so I'm just going to cover a couple ways our words have power and impact. So first, I'm going to talk about how our choices impact not only people, but also how they shape the world around us, and our responsibility as researchers to be mindful and aware of how our words impact other people. I'm going to do it. Let's hope it works. Hey, okay. So I'm going to outline how our communication choices have that broader reaching social impact, and how, people don't even necessarily need to be aware of that, the words that are spoken about them, to be impacted by them, especially in our case as researchers. Not everyone will read our words. I know it's shocking, but not everyone reads research, but they could still be impacted by it. Also, just you can tell a lot about someone by the way they speak. You can tell where they're from, as Carla kind of touched on. You can tell, about their beliefs, their ideas, their morals. It conveys so much, especially reading research, doing my first systematic review. I feel like I've learned way more about researchers than I have the topic, because I'm learning more about their biases and beliefs as I read the words that they use. So today I'm going to encourage us all to be thoughtful of our word choices by emphasizing how they impact others and their well-being. So let's think about how our words impact others. I was trying to think of a good example to use here. And one of them which came to mind is I recently did a study where I was supporting people who had experience with injection drug use to do secret shopper attempts at pharmacies. So they go into the pharmacies, try to purchase sterile syringes, and they're supposed to say, if asked why they need them, because they need to protect their bodies from Hep C and HIV or bloodborne viruses. However, they wanted to communicate that, but that was the gist of how they were supposed to ask for them. And I ended up getting a call from one of the field investigators with lived experience after one of her purchase attempts, and she tells me she's super excited. I think, oh, she got a sale. That's great, because I think we end up with just around like 20% of pharmacies where we were doing the study actually sold syringes. But no, that's not what happened. She happily tells me that she was refused syringes, but that the pharmacist, the pharmacist said she didn't want any addicts like hanging out in the store and have a bunch of addicts just like, I guess looking dirty and disturbing the real shoppers in the pharmacy. So that's why they didn't sell them. And that's why they were gatekeeping these resources people need to protect their bodies from harm. But so my friend, she's really happy about this because the pharmacist then took down, I guess, the medications that she could then give her for HIV and hepatitis, and told her about all the medications that if she, assuming she had insurance and all of that, that she could access when she did get infected by not having the sterile needles that the pharmacist refused to sell her. So my head was spinning a bit and I was like, okay, that's a lot, she's happy about that. And I'm the opposite of happy. I'm just like horrified. But I don't want to be, saying that to her. But so I mentioned the story because it really emphasized how much like addicts here, especially like the word addicts being like summoned like a demon from hell into the room. It's just, she had internalized that to such a degree that she, the field investigator did not question, I guess, that maybe she deserved to protect herself and that maybe it's not a nice thing to what had occurred. So it was so like the words had settled on her from probably frequency of being labeled as such, that it was without question that, of course, addicts don't deserve protection. They don't deserve safety, to be healthy. And so also the pharmacist as well, like the way the words that she used came so naturally in the way that her prejudice and the harm that could cause was just so common and without question. Like all of it was just without question. It was so normalized, and that's what words do, especially words like that are negative and we may use without even thinking about it. So I think that's just a good example to kind of get you thinking about that. And I'll touch on it more here in the next slide to go over social impact, which, beyond the power words have for this individual impact, which can be like emotional impact, which can still be devastating and really impact people's well-being. But especially in case of research, we've got this platform where we can communicate our ideas to a larger audience, somewhat larger audience. And so, we're responsible. Our words have more authority and more weight than others. We can really shape like the way that addicts, people are thought of, because ultimately these are people. And if we're speaking about them as such, they're more likely to be treated as people. So that is the novel idea. But yeah, so it extends beyond this like hurt feelings, which I think is often how it's like tried to be dismissed. And even myself, when I've kind of tried to weigh out like, in the US where I lived, 5 people every day die from overdose. And it's so many pressing issues. It can feel like why, being called a name that isn't nice, it seems very small if we're going to triage harm. But even though it may seem that way, it informs all the reason all of that other harm is occurring. And, if we don't have power to change the other things, like we can work to change them over time, but right now, you know, you can influence how you speak, you choose how you speak. So that's why to be mindful about it. Okay, yeah, I will, so yeah, I'll just wrap up by saying that, like if we think about how, like that word addict, it influenced how people were thought of and devalued, how they were treated. But then also because like we think about that example, like how the field investigator, the health outcome could be negative. She's exposed to harm. And that behavior also like, so it influenced her being exposed, maybe getting, you know, contracting a bloodborne virus or something. Then the fact that she contracted that virus is then used is further justification for othering this group, addicts in this case, and is emphasis of like how irresponsible and pathological they are without any of this context ever being considered. So that's just what I want to emphasize about like kind of the impact that words can have, and just give you some food for thought to consider, and maybe question your own beliefs you might have, or negative beliefs you might have about a group of people, or words you use without thinking about it. Just get you to think a little bit more, and myself as well. So thank you.
Hello, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here with you today, speaking to you about this really important topic, the power of words. Words define us. They describe us. They enable us and empower us to be understood by other people. We use words as a way of existing in the world. And when we don't have the words that we need, or when we're not being given the opportunities to have the words that describe and define us in a way that we find acceptable, we become invisible and we lose our power. Person-centered language, language that puts the person first, as Danielle was saying so powerfully there, not using words like addict, using words like, you know, a person who uses drugs, person who, you know, exists in the world. These are the words that affirm our common humanity. And with that, I'm going to be giving you a presentation that's rather different to the presentation I was planning to give you last week, because as many of you would know, I have worked for the last few years, and very proudly worked with the Australian Bureau of Statistics and also with UNSW on how to get LGBTQIA+ language in research to be better, so that we, as members of those communities, I myself am a queer woman. I'm also a widow, and not a particularly merry one, I'm sorry to say. I wish I could get some of that, you know, spider action happening, or star action. Anyway, words, you know, they matter to us. The ABS standard the ABS standard, which was released in 2020, was a standard that was about actually getting the language that has been completely worked through with all of our community representatives, with academics, to work out how we can structure demographic sections in research so that people who identify as LGBTQI, actually not A, can be represented in research accurately, respectfully. And this is a way that then we are known in the world. Our descriptors go out there. Suddenly we exist. We can be counted. We can actually see what our populations look like. We can see all of those different important elements of social determinants of health, how they work. So the ABS standard 2020 is a beautiful document. It's actually kind of messy and a bit hard to work with in some ways. UNSW has a kind of version of it that's a bit simpler, which still adheres to all of the principles. But as many of you would know, in the last couple of days, the government has announced that it's not going to change the census to use any more questions around identity. What that means is the community groups and the academics and the ABS people who have been working for years to try to further refine the language that we settled on in the ABS standard of 2020 to get it even better, to road test it in communities, to make sure that we are really using language that people are going to understand, not just members of our communities, but also heterosexual people, that people are going to be able to look at this and go, oh yeah, I see what this question is asking me, I can answer it. The government has decided, with no notice and with zero rationale, that this is not going to go ahead. Last night, I was rung by Andrew Lee. He made personal phone calls to all of us who sit on the committees working on these important words. And my goodness, that man has a way with words, because in the 10 minutes that we stayed on the phone, the only answer I could get about why this has happened was, it is a government decision. We so appreciate everything that you have done. We wanted to tell you personally. And mix those things up again and again and again. Absolutely zero rationale. So why has this happened? What does this mean? And what does this mean? What does this mean for stigma? There is abundant research on the stigma that is experienced by members of LGBTQIA+ populations. We know that it affects relationships, it affects parenting, it affects our sexual and reproductive health. It affects mental health and well-being. It can be associated with severe psychological distress. There can be manifestations of violence and abuse that come from stigma, and also subtle forms of prejudice. It may also be associated with problematic alcohol and other drug use. This is just a little laundry list of some of the ways that stigma affects our populations. How does it affect our populations to be suddenly told by our government that we are not worth counting, even though so much work has gone into working out how to count us, working out the questions to ask, finding out how people are going to receive those questions? There's been a great deal of focus testing in all kinds of different communities, including low literacy ones. What does it mean to say, we're not going to do that anymore? The cost of living is really high. That seems to be the thing that's floating in the ether, that because the cost of living is really high, that it's not worth doing this. So stigma and invisibility can go hand in hand. The less visible we are doing all of our different things, those of us who are members of the LGBTQIA+ populations, if we are invisible to people who are struggling to come out. At the moment, I'm doing research on a project that is around LGBTQIA+ people in cancer trials. And I'm hearing all kinds of stories, like one lovely medical oncologist talking to me about working with a woman who, you know, for months didn't say that her friend was actually, you know, her partner of 35 years. That is going to affect every element of her care. He was incredibly moved by this, and he said that one of the things that he did was then go back and think, what is it in my care that has enabled this to happen? Why was she not able, you know, to talk to me so that I could be more supportive to them as a couple as this was going on? So actually asking the questions and using the words makes a difference. It makes a difference in people's healthcare all the way through, whether we're talking about public health interventions that address us in different ways, or whether we're talking about the very intimate care that somebody who's receiving cancer care is going to receive. We deserve to be understood, and we deserve to be counted. So what are the impacts of invisibility? There's a whole lot of them. And as we know, it has been common practice, including, we've struggled with this in this university a great deal, binary indicators, everything having to fit into M and F, and trying to find ways around recognising non-binary people within systems that still try to make everything binary. This is also something that happens with Lifeblood, which is another great big system that I've worked with in the context of research. But we are breaking through. We are actually starting to recognise that it is worth changing our computer systems, and it is worth thinking again about how we can actually ask people questions about gender that can find out about people's transgender experience, that can be respectful of people who have intersex variations, and that enables people who identify in non-binary ways to actually be counted, to be recognised, to be seen, and to not be invisible anymore. a couple of quick examples here. This is a New South Wales, not New South, this is a UNSW form that I came across. I can't resist screenshotting them. They're meant to not exist anymore. They're meant to have at least, you know, another category there, but male, female. This one is even worse. This one is a little bit old because it's from the COVID days, and this is when you had to book in for your COVID vaccines. This is how New South Wales Health was asking us about our sex. You could be indeterminate or unknown. Fabulous. Isn't that a person-affirming way to identify? I wonder how many people tick that. So I will just quickly skip through these, that you recognise now that if there's one thing that I want you to take away from this, from the ABS, is that it is good practice in research to actually ask a two-step gender question. So to ask sex as reported at birth, and then ask people their gender. Because this enables us to actually recognise whether somebody has had a trans experience without actually putting trans out there as you know, some kind of alien concept, rather than just being, you know, a man or a woman. I want to finish up on a slightly more cheerful note, because I've talked to you a lot about the pain of invisibility in this. Another good thing has happened in the last few days, and that is that Roxanne Tickle won her case. Roxanne Tickle was had taken to court a group which was called Giggle, Girls Giggle or something. I've forgotten the name of it now. And Roxanne had been excluded from it because the group had decided that she wasn't a woman. The court case, I'll just read you out this is from Justice Bromwich, and it was quoted by Paula Gerber in The Conversation. And this was the finding. The sex of a person may take into account a range of factors, including biological and physical characteristics, legal recognition. So sex is not just biological, it is also legal, and how they present themselves and are recognised socially. So social and legal aspects of sex are important as well as biological. That's what I want to leave you with. I want to leave you with this idea that people can use words that make the world better for people, that enable people to connect, and that enable people to be seen as they see themselves. And I think that is our responsibility as researchers. Sometimes it's tricky, but it's always worth it. So thank you.
Okay, so we're going to reach outside of the Kirby Institute now for our next presenter, who is Gayle McNaught, joining us online. And Gayle is the Public Affairs and Advocacy Manager at SANE. So we're looking to people, other areas with expertise, and in this case, mental health. So Gayle is a scientist and communicator with over 2 decades of experience in public awareness, community education, and advocacy. Gayle's got a particular interest in using evidence-based health communication to promote positive change and better health outcomes. At SANE, Gayle is actively working to amplify the voices of those with lived experience, improve public understanding, and build a better life for Australians facing complex mental health challenges. And part of the reason we reached out to Gayle and SANE is they've been running a program called Stigma Watch for more than 20 years, where they've been calling out issues of representation of people with mental ill health, excuse me, and reaching out directly to journalists and publishing companies about that. So Gayle, we can't wait to hear from you. Over to you.
Thank you, Carla. I'm just going to navigate my technology of sharing my screen. But in the meantime, what I will do is just say I'm coming to you today from the beautiful Ngunnawal lands, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. As Carla said, thank you for that introduction, and thank you as well to Danielle and Bridget, because they were such fantastic presentations, and I found myself actually thinking really hard and thinking about all the parallels between what you were talking about and mental health. So I work for an organisation called SANE. SANE is one of the oldest mental health organisations in Australia. We've been around for almost 40 years. We were started by 2 very passionate women who both had children with schizophrenia. They were both quite horrified when their child was diagnosed at the lack of information, the lack of support, and most importantly, at the horrendous stigma that their child, but also their family experienced following the diagnosis. Some who are of a certain age, like myself in the audience, might recognise the names of one of the founders. It was a journalist called Anne Devison, who was quite a well-known ABC journalist. And when her son Jonathan was diagnosed, she was just gobsmacked to find that someone that, you know, had a bit of influence, was relatively affluent, was relatively educated, still couldn't access appropriate care. And that is why they formed SANE. So SANE has always had stigma, and especially kind of lived experiences of stigma running through our DNA. I think one of the things that reinforces this, you know, as a community, we have gained great acceptance of mental health and mental ill health over the past couple of decades. And I think Beyond Blue in particular deserves some credit for making people a lot more comfortable in talking about issues that affect mental health. But there certainly are issues that still encounter significant amounts of stigma, and that is particularly people that are living with severe or long-term or complex mental health challenges. We conducted a national survey 4 years ago that showed that, you know, significant experiences of stigma were still happening amongst the people within the same community. And one of the things in particular that stood out was that 90% of people said they'd been exposed to stigmatizing or discriminatory or derogatory references to themselves in the media. And because of this is why SANE thought, you know, this is something that we can definitely have an impact on. And I think having a founder that was a journalist was probably part of that as well. So SANE Stigma Watch was established in 1999. It was one of the very first programs in the world to actively address stigma in media. So media is one of these, you know, forms of communication, I suppose, that can have great power on our perceptions and on the language that we use as a community. They can significantly increase stigma by reinforcing stereotypes, by using poor language, by highlighting aspects or, you know, the antisocial aspects that can happen with mental ill health. But what the research quite recently has shown is that they can also have incredibly powerful destigmatizing effects by using first-person language, by telling real life stories. They can actually actively improve people's attitudes toward mental ill health. So Stigma Watch operates in partnership with an organisation called Mindframe, or Mindrain, as I've very cleverly spelt it there. Apologies, didn't do a proofread apparently. They are based in Newcastle, and they have created the world's first suite of evidence-based guides around language for media and public communication. So Stigma Watch partners with Mindframe in that we actively address not just media, but also any outlets that communicate en masse to the public. So when I use the term media, I'm also referring to stage and screen. Podcasts are obviously something that's grown considerably, and more emergingly, social media as well. So I'll talk a little bit about research later, but the research shows that this program has actively improves media content and reduces harm. But not only does it do that, it's actually giving the community a form of empowerment, a form of standing up and saying, this is who we are and this is how we want to be seen. I've included this picture here because I love this picture. This was, I think, in the late 80s, as you can possibly tell from the fashion. This was the very first kind of public SANE activity where they organised a march down Flinders Street to call out the stigma that was being experienced by their loved ones and by themselves. So how does Stigma Watch work? Well, at a very basic level, we actually monitor media twice a day, and we reach out to journalists and editorial teams with recommendations for how they can make their content less stigmatising. But we also, as I said, provide that nationally accessible platform for people to become a Stigma Watcher. We have almost 7,000 Stigma Watchers nationally, so they can actually review their own local mass communications and send us things that they find personally stigmatizing. We also have, I guess you could call it a speakers bureau at SANE, where we have around 70 people with lived experience of complex mental health conditions, both individuals with the experience in themselves, but also importantly carers. And we share them and their stories with the media to try and actively facilitate positive media stories as well. We have quite a long-term research program that we run in partnership with the University of Melbourne, where we're also contributing to the evidence base around mental health stigma. So Stigma Watch is based on language, as highlighted by Danielle and Bridget and Carla. Language, is critical to how we shape our perceptions of the world. And in the case of mental ill health, there is, always been a history of words and also images, and I think it's important for us to flag that, and I'll talk about that in a minute as well, that really reinforce the negative stereotypes that can be aligned with mental illness. There's very much, in recent times, almost a patriarchal view of people with mental illness. You are sick, and we will help you get better. That was almost the medical view of mental illness as well. Thankfully, that's kind of shifted, I believe, over the past 10 years. But we really look to shift that language and how we refer to people experiencing mental ill health. So it's less of their condition and more of who they are as a person. So, for example, we don't say schizophrenic anymore. We don't say anorexic. We don't talk about people being deranged or crazed. We don't belittle aspects of the mental health system by saying things like, nut house or happy pills. And what we also don't do is belittle the experience of people by using it in a more casual context. We've got this schizophrenic economy, as it says there. Now, interestingly, these guidelines were developed using co-design. We worked with Mindframe. There's a link at the bottom there. You can have a look at those. There is actually some fantastic resources for clinicians and also, I believe, researchers in terms of the appropriate language and method of referring to people with mental ill health. But one of the things that we find at SANE, which is quite interesting, because obviously we are very much driven by our community, and there are some words that are listed here as being problematic that actually our community find quite powerful and are reclaiming words like mad, for example, or schizo. Actually, there's an organisation in Melbourne called Schizo Inc., which are a group of performing artists with schizophrenia. So I guess, language evolves, words evolves. These types of guidelines are constantly changing to reflect the community that we're representing.
1 minute, Gayle?
Yes.
Great.
So, thank you. Here's some of the examples of things that we pick up. Again, just wanted to flag that imagery is just as important as words. You'll see the word druggie, for example, murder, suicide, psychotic. These people, the comedians on the top left there, formed a band called OCDC, which was highly stigmatizing towards people with OCD. And I've included this picture of what we colloquially call the head clutcher, where that's often the image that you see associated in media when references to mental illness are in there. We try and kind of direct journalists away from that. The research that we do, as I said, you can go away and Google Stigma Watch if you like, and you'll see some of our publications. But critically, what we do is we actually embed the experiences and the thoughts of the lived experience back into our program frequently. So we've created guidelines for our peer ambassadors and how they prefer to engage with media, and also how media can best engage with people with lived experience as well. So I just thought I'd finish by giving a very quick case study of, I guess, stigma reduction in action. As you know, I know the Kirby Institute is based in central eastern Sydney. Many of you would have had firsthand experience of the tragic events in Bondi Junction back in April. Many of you would have consumed the media that came out immediately following that attack, and also, I guess, the evolution of the media over the following week. I opened my email on the Sunday after the event on the Saturday, and I just had an email from one of our most beloved peer ambassadors, Sandy Jeffs. Sandy is someone who's lived for a long period of time with schizophrenia, and she just said, "Dear Gayle, what are you going to do about this? Love from Sandy." So we kind of said we've got to really act, and I guess we've got to do it in two ways. We need to recognise the fact that what's happened here is terrible, for the victims, and that there are going to be people that are going to be experiencing severe trauma from this, who are going to have their own mental health challenges as a result of this event. But what we also need to recognise is that, you know, schizophrenia, people with schizophrenia are, you know, not always violent people that act in this way. In fact, the research very clearly shows that people with schizophrenia are far more likely to be the victims of violence than the perpetrators of violence. So what we did is we went out to the media, and we also at the same time went out to our community. So over the course of the next few days, we got on the phones and we contacted journalists, and we put them in contact with people like Cameron, who you see here, who's one of our peer ambassadors who lives with schizophrenia. And we got as much, I guess, factual first-person information out into the media as we could. I remember the one thing that I do remember quite clearly about that was having quite a robust conversation with a journalist from the Weekend Australian, who started off the conversation by saying, isn't it true everyone with schizophrenia should be locked up? They shouldn't be allowed in the community. And by the end of the conversation, her stance had softened, and the piece that came out was actually quite well thought and well reported. So, you know, we can change these perceptions in real time. What we also found, though, as well, was that we had this groundswell of the community get involved. People who within the SANE community who had previously been perhaps ashamed to admit to their diagnosis and ashamed to stand up, stood up. And they posted and they shared information, and they said, I have schizophrenia and I'm not like this person, and I'm not ashamed of it. So it really had a really great impact on the community as well. But I think from a Stigma Watch perspective, you know, we had the most reports that we've ever had in the history of the program during that time. People really got engaged. People wanted to be part of it. And I think I just wanted to finish up by this kind of change. And this emphasises that the shift in language doesn't have to be great. It doesn't have to be a big deal. It doesn't have to be hard to recognise people's experience in a more compassionate and empathetic way. This top sentence, he was diagnosed with schizophrenia at 17. He was living an itinerant lifestyle. He was a recluse and had battled many demons. There's a lot of parts of that sentence there that are quite stigmatizing and really not very thoughtful. This was Herald Sun, God bless the Herald Sun, and they changed it after we approached them to the below, which is factual. It's still newsworthy, but it's a lot less stigmatizing. And these are the changes that we are working on day to day to try and achieve through the Stigma Watch program.
Thanks very much, Gayle.
Thank you very
That
much.
is awesome. Your contacts are up there on the screen. And we can put them through. Do you want to put that last slide back up, Gayle, while we're swapping over so people can grab your email and other details if needed? But just an awesome service, and it goes to our responsibility as researchers and as experts with knowledge to ensure that that kind of language we're using is accurate and clear and doesn't carry these weights of other messages that circulate out there so easily, as you can see in the media in that example. So let's give Gayle a big round of thanks. That was terrific.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. And we're going to finish our presentations today with the wonderful Scott Harlum, President a couple of times over of the National Association of People Living with HIV, bringing that experience and many more to public advocacy. Over to you, Scott.
Is the price I'm going to pay for no, not a close-up on my face. Fantastic. Good day, everyone. Thanks for coming along and joining the seminar, The Power of Words, and thank you, Carla, for the invitation to speak. To start with, I want to be clear about my purpose today. My intention is not to come across as some staunch hardline HIV language police. I'm here because I want to encourage you, not discourage, to not leave you with an impression that language in HIV-related research is a minefield and something that you need to be anxious about. I want to encourage you to utilise the resources available to you. I want you to know that NAPWA and people with HIV generally a resource which is available to you, because I know and NAPWA knows that language changes over time. What is stigmatising language can change over time and is subjective. What is discriminatory, as a side note, language is less subjective and changes much less over time, for the record. Language which is stigmatising in one context may not be in another, and language which is stigmatising to one person may not be to another. I've learned to be pretty thick-skinned about language, but I've had 2 kidney transplants in my lifetime and have spent a total 14.5 years of my life receiving hemodialysis treatment. My blood and my body have been subject to a great deal of discussion in high-end clinical contexts, and I've experienced some horrendously stigmatizing and discriminatory language and behaviours from nurses and doctors over the years. I know that it is not a perfect world. But the fact that you were here demonstrates that you have an understanding that language is important and that you want to get it right in your research. So before I'm done, I'm going to give you share with you a foolproof approach to getting language right, to not inadvertently stigmatizing or discriminating through language in your research. It's a foolproof approach regardless of the when, where, who, or what of your research. It's an approach which will absolutely ensure language in your research isn't a minefield for you or something to be anxious about. And again, encouragingly, it's an approach many of you will already have heard of and may already be applying in your research. And I see some familiar faces that I know are, but more of that shortly. First, I want to make some more general points. And the first is be conscious of the audience for your research. Never has there been a health consumer created quite like a person with HIV. HIV is an identity, HIV is a community, HIV is a political movement. In a way, unlike people with other chronic illnesses generally are, people with HIV are engaged, knowledgeable, and influential. And the key point about people with HIV is health consumers for the purposes of today. People with HIV routinely have access to and are likely to read your research when you write about or publish it. People with HIV will broadcast their thoughts, do work as a well-connected network, and will comment on, celebrate, or critique your research. And you need to be conscious of that. HIV research does not exist within a research or academic vacuum. And if you use stigmatizing or discriminatory language, it is going to be pointed out to you and publicized widely. So do not get caught out. But of course, there are other audiences for your research if that research relates to HIV. So another key point to make is that you need to be conscious that language shapes perceptions and outcomes. Language plays a significant role in shaping attitudes, influencing behaviour, and guiding research practices. It doesn't just communicate facts. It also reflects values, biases, and societal norms which can either reinforce or challenge stigma and discrimination. An example, the history of HIV, of the HIV response in Australia itself, can be read in 2 ways. One, as we've heard plenty of over time, that gay men are to blame for HIV. Gay men and their immoral and bad behaviour are to blame for HIV. But then there's the second reading, which is that in Australia, for 40 plus years, we've avoided a more generalised epidemic because gay men responded responsibly to the emergence of HIV. The difference, gay men good, gay men bad, and how stigmatising this story really comes down to who you talk to, which is why it is so important to talk to people with HIV, particularly if the findings of your research are going to be challenging for people with HIV. Second point that I want to make is about understanding stigmatising and discriminatory language. What is stigmatising? What is discriminatory language? As I said earlier, language changes over time, and what is stigmatising can change over time and depending on the context within which it's being used. What is appropriate language can also change from one person to another. To give an example, some of you may have noticed that I use people with HIV to describe the community that I'm part of. Other people will use people living with HIV. But for me, the very intentional inclusion of the word living speaks directly to the flip side of that coin. In my mind, and I think that have many questions, why living needs to be so deliberately pointed out. For me, my mind goes immediately to the opposite intention. In my mind, I go immediately to death. For me, the term people living with HIV is actually stigmatising. It is not a positive reinforcement, a strong or bold statement that we are still here. It is a constant reminder for all, I think, that HIV once meant almost certain death. And for those uneducated or uninformed about the modern reality of HIV, I suspect in their mind it says that somewhere out there, there are other people with HIV not living but dying. It's a conversation I've been having within the community of people I lead for a while now, and it's a conversation or an argument that I continue to lose and within that community. So for your sake, I would suggest that people living with HIV would continue to be the appropriate way to describe the community. And unfortunately, that also means the acronym PLHOV is the one you should use. I say unfortunately because I hate acronyms as well. For me, there is nothing more dehumanizing than to be referred to by an acronym. Another reason I argue people with HIV is appropriate language. It saves on a superfluous word. But my internal battle aside, the point is that what is stigmatizing can change from one person to another. It's a minefield, right? Fear not. Remember, I'm going to make it foolproof for you. But in general terms, stigmatizing language is language that perpetuates fear, shame, or blame. Some extreme examples of which are AIDS victim, carrier, infected. Discriminatory language could be described as words or phrases that marginalize or stereotype individuals based on race, gender, sexual orientation, or lifestyle. For example, high-risk groups without contextualizing social determinants. The use of this language can lead to harmful consequences in both research and public health efforts. And that's why it matters, because language impacts individuals and communities. Language can have a disproportionately large effect on an individual. For example, imply a person is a slut, even accidentally in a clinical setting, and they'll be locked to your care. They will not come back. There are real-world implications of stigmatizing and discriminatory language. Language can deter people from seeking treatment, testing, or participating in research, and stigmatizing or discriminatory language disproportionately harms marginalized groups, contributing to health disparities and undermining trust in the healthcare systems and research. Stigma also compounds. So one little experience of stigma may mean a person decides to avoid healthcare altogether, and that's not in their interests or in the interests of public health. Oh, and again, in the clinical or public-facing setting, plaster everywhere that your service is safe. Otherwise, you'll be assumed to be unsafe. Be quiet about your stigma and be loud about your acceptance. So what are some principles you can follow for non-stigmatizing and non-discriminatory language? And this is not the foolproof method that I promise, that is still to come. But some principles to follow to ensure your language is not stigmatizing and discriminatory are to use more inclusive language, by which I'm talking about person-first or person-centered language. Prioritize the person over the condition. For example, person living with HIV instead of HIV-positive individual, or as I would argue, person with HIV rather than an acronym. Use neutral and non-judgmental terms, language that describes rather than labels or blames. For example, people affected by HIV instead of risk groups. And contextualize language and be precise so you're able to accurately describe communities without reinforcing harmful stereotypes. For example, people vulnerable to HIV due to social or economic factors. Promote inclusivity in your research and adopt inclusive language in your research design, data collection, analysis, and reporting. Inclusive language leads to more accurate data because the identities and experiences of your research participants are being respected, and because you're able to use language that acknowledges diversity without reducing individuals to stereotypes. Thank you. Another reason it matters is because as a researcher, you have an ethical, scientific, and social responsibility to not stigmatize or discriminate. Language is central to ethical research practices. Respectful communication honors the dignity of research participants and communities. Adopting inclusive language strengthens scientific credibility and ensures research findings are relevant, accountable, and do not perpetuate harm. And addressing stigma and discrimination through language aligns with broader goals of equity, social justice, and public health. So to finish then, the foolproof approach to ensuring non-stigmatizing and non-discriminatory language. In short, it's MIPA, the meaningful involvement of people with HIV. In a research context, what this requires is involving people with HIV at the earliest opportunity and sharing power and control of your research with them all the way through the process, right to the end. It requires maximising the potential for positive involvement by working with communities to set the research agenda to ensure that what is being researched is relevant and so has the greatest chance of success. It requires involving the community in the design and implementation of research projects to ensure research is safe and respectful of people with HIV, and it requires that people with HIV be involved in the interpretation of your research findings to ensure data is not misunderstood in ways that obscures the truth or perpetuates stigma. Simply, the foolproof approach to ensuring language is not a minefield for you in your research is to meaningfully involve people with HIV in your research or to apply MIPA. Thank you.
That is just terrific. And we've got 6 or 7 minutes left and lots of things potentially to get through. So we've got a number of speakers. So if people want to jump up, the speakers want to jump up to any issues, please use this microphone or the ones at the side. And I'm just going to check if we've got Q&A. But whilst I'm doing that, questions, if you want to jump up to the microphone too, so that people online can hear them. But Bridget, first to you, about the census decision, is it worth lobbying local members or someone else?
I think it's always worth lobbying local members. I would say go for it. I'm certainly going to be doing that. Whether it's going to have any impact, I mean, I suspect it's not going to have any immediate impact. What it might mean is that if we get another term of this government, maybe it will make a difference then. And particularly if there's some, scary things happening in formerly safe Labor seats might start to, coming from our communities, it could have an impact. So I just think, yeah, we should always write to our local members when they do something that's really, really wrong. So please do.
Great. What I was thinking about in relation to Gayle's 7,000 stigma watches, and Scott, your position or explanation that people with HIV read the literature and might be in contact with people, is it's a really interesting position to put yourself as a researcher, is who's reading it, to be very aware that the audience could be very broad, and you have that responsibility to ensure that your language is ethical and clear and precise. Over to you.
Hello, my name's Jay. I'm from NAPWA. My question is for Scott. Scott, would you recommend the NAPWA, I can't remember if it's called a media guide or a language guide?
You tell me, last time it was updated. then I'll tell you whether
and we're always open to feedback.
There are a few resources around. There's a WHO resource, I think, on language. There's a Health Equity Matters, formerly a FAO research, a media guide that talks about language. But again, one of the central points that I made is that language changes over time.
Yeah.
And I do know, I'm on the board of Health Equity Matters as well, and I do know that guide's is being updated as we speak, or hasn't been for a while. So there are resources available.
Great. Yeah. And a follow-up question. I've been approached on a couple of occasions by people who want to make sure that their language is okay. Do you think it's okay for researchers to collaborate with people working in the sector or living with HIV?
Absolutely. That was again one of the central points I made is use us as a resource. Involve people with HIV from the beginning to the end of your research projects, be that steering committee or consultative committees or whatever, but reach out in a completely random one-off sense as well to NAPWA. We're there to be a resource. We're not here to make life hard for researchers. We're here to make life easier for researchers, so we all get the results that improve our services and our response. So yeah, absolutely, Joe.
Excellent, thank you, and great presentation, Scott. Loved it.
And I think there's things to think about. There are these language guides that exist, like I showed you the diabetes one, the NAPWA Health Equity Matters one. There's ones from drug user organisations. There's also ones which are age-positive language guides. There's ones which will be based on gender, on culture. It feels a bit overwhelming, but the issue is to reflect, to think, to engage, and to be precise and clear about what it is you're trying to communicate. Over to you, Amanda.
Carla, this is probably for Gayle, I suppose, but you're talking about resources. Do journalism students, dare I call them, before they get out they're allowed out into the wide world, are they spoken to by somewhere like Stigma Watch or organisations to actually maybe get it right in the beginning? Not dissimilar to, I think, potentially what's trying to be happening in the doctor world.
Yep.
Get it before they're out in the world.
Did you hear that, Gayle?
Yeah, I did. And they are indeed. So Mindframe, which was the organisation that created the evidence-based guidelines that you can access online, they do a lot of training to journalism students. I believe they actually also do training to psychology students as well, because somewhat ironically, some of the worst cases of stigma against mental ill health come from mental health practitioners themselves. So there is some training that's going on. I think there is more that we can do. And as I said, the training at the moment is very focused on media, but I think we need to start also looking at people that work in the social media space as well, which is where most people consume their news these days.
I think we should also recognise the social determinants of journalism. You know, they live in a political economy as well as the rest of us, and the pressures on them to get things out, to do things quickly with little resources is really real. So being able to provide people, journalists, with those resources, even to counter the pressure they might be feeling from their sensationalist sub-editors or editors is good work that we could all be doing. Final comments or thoughts or questions that remain unanswered for you. This is, you know, a lifelong journey for all of us. We're all thinking and learning about this, no matter how far we've gone down this path. Any last thoughts from our presenters to wrap up? Philip, over to you.
Thanks, everyone. But I guess I want to have a look at the SANE website and see what there may be there. But I wondered whether, Scott, there are any best practice papers, for example, where people might have got it really right in terms of how they use language. Because it is sometimes, as someone who's, you know, tried to, with good intent, I hope, tried to write things, it's sometimes difficult.
Yours is one of the faces I looked at when I pointed to the room and said, you know, I'm encouraged that this room knows about me, but look, I'm not the person to ask. I made a comment to Carla when she asked me to speak today. I'm not the actual resident expert on language at NAPWA, but what Carla gets at NAPWA. So
Take that home with me. That's great.
That's an informal policy that we have. So I'd reach out to Dr. John Rule, be my recommendation. I'm sorry to not be able to answer directly, but I think that's the best answer.
Great. We can probably point to a lot of bad examples, and you know, we're not here to do that. You know, we're here to, you know, as a community, think clearly, carefully, safely about what we're doing. So please join me in thanking these amazing panel of presenters today. Just fantastic stuff.